Hi, I'm Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and welcome to the fourth in our five-part series as we help the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore celebrate its 100th birthday. As usual, I'm going to be joined in this video by Beth Goldsmith, who is chair of the Associated's Board of Directors. But before I turn it over to Beth, I thought I'd say a few words to get us going. Today's theme is the role of women in philanthropy over that 100-year time frame. And we're out here filming in front of the 5th Regiment Armory. And if you're wondering, why are you in front of the 5th Regiment Army? Well, this was the site of an enormous fundraising campaign some years ago that I'll let Beth talk about. But let me get started in the 1940s, 1945 in particular. Women had always been a part of the Associated's efforts as donors, as volunteers, as leaders. But in the 1940s, they really came into the world of philanthropy in a big way and in big numbers. In 1945 was the year that the Women's Campaign Committee was started with a woman as chair, Helen Dalsheimer. And when they got started, they had big goals. They targeted 7,700 other women to raise money from. This was right as World War II was concluding, and there was an enormous need in Europe's Jewish communities for help to address the atrocities that World War II had caused. In Miss Dalsheimer's words, the task is so enormous that every Jewish woman must do her share in this sacred cause. And the folks in that committee certainly did their share and more. They wrote letters, they knocked on doors, and one thing they did that their male counterparts had not done before them is they organized teas, afternoon teas, fundraising teas. These were small groups of women who met in each other's living rooms, and they organized dozens, maybe hundreds of them, and they were very successful. One particular tea, a woman came back who had just visited an orphanage in Europe and shared stories of that. And that was a really good fundraising afternoon. But keeping to the commitment that the Associated has always had from its very first days of trying to let everyone participate in the giving community and making it possible for them to do so, the Women's Committee formed in 1948 a new campaign called the Dime a Day campaign, or if you do the math, that's $36.50 a year. And they again targeted women. I think they had over 500 women participate in total. Apparently there's a story of one woman who was writing her check for the Dime a Day campaign, and her husband came home and said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Well, I'm joining the Dime a Day campaign." And he said, "But that's more than I make." Undaunted, she continued to write the check and sent it in proudly, and we hope and assume that her husband eventually was proud as well. All right, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Beth to continue us forward. All right, Beth, we're all yours.
Thank you, Johns. I'm actually going to talk about two different women-led efforts. The first was on May 15, 1949, a year and a day after the founding of the Nation of Israel. It was on this day that the first of what came to be a tradition was started, and that tradition is Giving Day, or G-Day for short. On that May 15th in 1949, 1,200 women fanned out across Baltimore to visit with 12,000 families in a single day to raise money for immigrants who were arriving into Baltimore and Maryland. This first effort was a success and raised $45,000 to help the new arrivals. And in case you're wondering, men played a role as well. Over 450 of them volunteered as chauffeurs. 2 years later, the Women G-Day Army grew to 2,000 and reached even more people, and they had to use the enormous 5th Regiment Armory as their headquarters. In the 1950s, G-Day had garnered national attention and was covered by none other than Life magazine. The second women-led innovation came about 15 years after the first Giving Day was launched. By the middle of the 1960s, it had become harder and harder to recruit volunteers to spend all day knocking on doors, and also harder to find people willing to open their doors to strangers. In response to these challenges, in 1964, the Women's Division, the group that ran Giving Day, pivoted, to use a modern term. Instead of knocking on doors, why not ring them up by telephone? So in 1964, the first phone-a-thon was born. Over a 3-week period, 60 women volunteers worked in shifts from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. making phone calls. In all, they made something like 18,000 calls from a phone bank located on Reisterstown Road. And they brought in donations. In fact, they brought in more donations than did Giving Day the year before. And now, back to you, Johns, to keep us moving forward into the 60s.
All right, thanks so much, Beth. I'm going to wrap up with a few words about how the roles of women have changed and not changed over the years, beginning in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the roles of women were changing all across the country, and here in Baltimore at the Associated as well. Volunteering with the Associated reflected those changes and also advanced them. A few notable things, for example, the Young Matrons Committee became known as the Young Women's Leadership Council, a change not just in vocabulary, but really in where women were and were going. A new group formed called the Business and Professional Council for Women, again, targeting women who were working outside the home. This group met in the evenings. And another new group was started called the Lion of Judah Society, again, targeting women of a certain means who could give larger gifts. So not only doing fundraising, but helping form a community of giving that way as well. In the 1990s, things shifted yet one more time. The Associated got its first woman chair, Shoshana Cardin. That was in the 1990s. And she brought along more changes. For example, the Women's Committee was renamed the Women's Department to reflect a more prominent role. And the committee's leadership got to sit at the table with the overall leadership of the Associated, so literally where the big decisions were made. And that group also started another effort called Chana, which helps people experiencing domestic violence. Again, another women-led effort. That was in the 1990s. Over the last 20 years, things have kept shifting and changing and innovating. The Jewish Women's Giving Foundation was created to help women pool their resources and then collectively decide where they want them to go. So another way of empowering women in decision-making. Another new group, the Jewish Professional Women's Initiative, offers mentoring for women in the working world, as well as building a network. And then finally, two groups whose names I love. One is called Chapter 2, and this is for empty nesters, women who are empty nesters, connecting them to build a community around that. And the final one is called Chapter 3, and this is for women over 60 to get together and share stories and build their own community there as well. All right, I'm going to wrap up and say that in the Associated's history, women have played leading roles throughout, whether it was that 1945 campaign or the Giving Day campaign or these more recent efforts. And those things have changed, but one thing that's not is the commitment to helping Jewish community here in Baltimore and around the world. All right, thanks so much. We hope to see you for our last video.